Let's look at another example. Many people believe that criminals who plead guilty get lighter sentences than those who are convicted in trials. The accompanying table summarizes randomly selected sample data for San Francisco defendants in burglary cases. All of the subjects had prior prison sentences. And in this case, we're going to use a 0.05 significance level to test the claim that sentence is independent of the plea. Okay, so here we want to decide whether or not somebody pleading guilty or not guilty has any association with whether or not they're going to be convicted. So like before, we can go through and sum up the totals in the rows and the columns, and then use that to compute the expected values. So for instance here, let's total up the rows. We got 390 plus 60 is 450, and then 561 plus 17 is 588. Oops, sorry, I made a mistake there. 578. And then totaling the columns, 390 plus 561. Here, let me double check, make sure I'm not making a calculation error. 390 plus 561 is 951. 60 plus 17 is 77. So then adding up the grand total here, get 1,028. Okay. So one thing we can do now is we can compute the expected value for each of these rows and columns, or for each of these 4 entries. And to remind ourselves, how do we do that? Well, we'll take the total in this row and the total in this column, multiply them, and then divide by the grand total. So if I do that, 450 by 951 divided by the grand total, which was 1,028, would give me the expected value there. So let's see what that would be. It's something around 416.29. Here, I'll put that over here. So here's our expected value. So already we can kind of see a little bit of a difference there. Similarly here for the next entry, we could do the same thing. 560, oops, sorry, I want to use the total here. So 951 times 578 divided by the grand total, 1,028. And let's see, what would we get there for the expected value? About 534.70. Okay, so again here comparing that with the observed value, we see there is a slight difference. Here, let's do the same thing now with these guys. So here we have a total of 450 by a total of 77 in the column, divided by the grand total, 1,028. So that gives me an expected value of 33.71. And then here for this entry here, we'll have grand total, total in the row of 578, total in the column of 77, divided by a grand total of 1,028. Okay, so that gives me an expected value here of about 43.29. And again, just comparing these values here with the observed values, we see there is a bit of a difference. So with that, we might expect that here there actually is some dependence. In other words, maybe depending on whether or not the person pleads guilty or not guilty, it has an effect on whether or not they get sent to prison. And let's go through and do the whole test. So remember, for the null hypothesis, it'll always be that the rows and columns are independent. So in this case, the plea is independent from the sentence. And then the alternative would be that they are dependent. So in other words, whether or not somebody pleads guilty might have an effect on whether or not they get sent to prison. Now we've actually already gone through and we've computed these expected values. So here I'll just fill in those values again to remind you. So I believe here we got let me see. For 16.29, 534.71, 33.71, and 43.29. Okay. Now what you'll notice is that if I sum all these up, you should get the same totals that we had before. Let's just double check that now. If I do 416.29 added with 534.71, you actually should get the same total that we had before. Let me just make sure I'm entering it right. Yeah. So here I get the total 951 that we had before. And then same here, if I add these guys up, 33.71 plus 43.29, I get the total, which was 77. And then here again, if I add these rows and columns here, I should get the same totals that we had before, 416.29, 450, and 578. Okay. So we actually get the same totals before, but notice that these expected values would be what we would expect to see if these two variables, in other words, being guilty or not guilty, pleading guilty versus pleading not guilty, has no effect on whether or not somebody gets sent to prison. These are the values that we would expect to see. So let's use our calculator now to compute the rest of it. So before I do that, let's go ahead and enter the observed values from the previous slide into a 2x2 matrix. Okay, so what I'll do here is I'll go to the matrix button, and I'll move down to the edit menu, and I'll select matrix A to edit, and then it's going to be a 2x2 matrix, and we'll enter those observed values that we had before, which, to remind you, were 390, 60, 561, and 17. So we're going to enter those 4 values here into this 2x2 matrix. And once we got that, now we can go to stat tests and then go down to the chi-squared test, and we'll have it reference matrix A. So we'll go to stat tests, chi-squared test, and then we'll have it reference matrix A for the observed, and the expected will just have it output the values into matrix B. Even though here we actually computed the expected values here by hand, here this kind of saves you the hassle of having to do that. If you wanted to look at those expected values, you can now bring up that matrix B and look at them. So when we hit calculate now, for the chi-squared value, I get something around 39.43. So actually that would be kind of far out here. Pretty far out, 39.43. And you would certainly expect there the p-value is going to be this really tiny value because you get such a slim graph at that far off value of chi-squared. And actually what we see is we get some really tiny p-value here. So here for the chi-squared value we got 39.43, and for the p-value I get something on the order of 3.39 times 10 to the negative 10. So this is a really tiny value, and certainly smaller than any significance level here. So looking back at the significance level we had before, I believe it was 0.05, this is certainly less than that. And so in this case we can definitely reject the null hypothesis. And so we can conclude here that the plea is not independent. So since we were rejecting the null hypothesis, we're saying that those two variables are not independent.